Introduction. By 1971, the Shah of Iran thought he was in a good place. His fiercest critic, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was in exile in Iraq, hundreds of miles away. Savak, Iran's secret police, were keeping a lid on political dissent, giving him complete political security. The tenets of the Shah's White Revolution of 1963 were steadily underway. The Shah felt confident in his position and the direction of Iran. The new U.S. President, Richard Nixon, was also confident of the Shah. The war in Vietnam was teaching the United States that their political and military strength had its limits. As such, President Nixon wanted Iran to become the new Middle East watchdog. This role had once fell to the United Kingdom. However, after suffering several political setbacks, including the Suez Crisis of 1958, the Brits were no longer a player in the region. The Shah gladly accepted the responsibility and purchased billions of dollars in American military equipment. Then, in collaboration with Israel, Iran began supporting a Kurdish insurgency in northern Iraq. But all was not well in the Shah's Iran. Since his opponents could not openly express themselves in the political arena, they went underground instead. This ultimately led to the formation of various insurgent groups. One such group was the Iranian People's Communist Guerrillas. In February 1971, they attacked an Iranian military outpost but were quickly overwhelmed. 13 insurgents were arrested, tried, convicted, and executed. The People's Communist Guerrillas retaliated with a string of assassinations, including American military officers, U.S. embassy workers, and Iranian military officials. Iran's security forces responded with more attacks, and before long, there were daily clashes between the two sides. Most of the members of these insurgent groups came from a hodgepodge of dissidents. Some were communist, but others were religious, while others simply wanted democracy. But they were mostly all educated, middle-class young people. These feelings of political repression coincided with a general malaise sweeping much of the globe. This was especially felt in the Arab world, which has suffered multiple defeats at the hands of Israel. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria decided to change that around. The two Arab nations launched a surprise attack on Israel during Yom Kippur, Judaism's holiest day. Egypt attacked the Sinai Peninsula in the south, which had been occupied by Israel since the 1967 Six-Day War. Syria attacked from the Golan Heights in the north, which had also been occupied by Israel since 1967. Israel floundered for a while before regaining their composure and taking the initiative. Before long, Israel had turned back both nations' advances and were less than 100 miles from Cairo and 200 miles from Damascus. The United Nations eventually brokered a ceasefire, but the Arab nations did not forget the U.S.'s role in the conflict. Even though the United States claimed to be an impartial proponent of a peaceful resolution, President Nixon had authorized Operation Nickelback. So what was Operation Nickelback? Well, since Israel was caught off guard by the attack, much of their military arsenal was not immediately available. During Operation Nickelback, the United States airlifted military supplies including Sidewinder missiles, M60 tanks, F-4 Phantom jet fighters, and C-130 Hercules transport planes. The Arab members of OPEC retaliated by cutting oil production by 25% while increasing prices at the same time. Before long, the entire globe was engulfed in a global recession and facing oil shortages. Most European countries, who had not taken sides during the Arab-Israeli conflict, blamed the United States for the embargo. The oil embargo lasted from October 1973 to March 1974. Iran, however, as an ally of the United States, did not cut their oil production, but they did increase their oil prices by 17%. The result was a massive influx of money for Iran. Iran had $4 billion in oil revenue in 1973. By 1975, this had increased to almost $18 billion, and then $98 billion over the next 5 years. This new oil wealth gave Iran a level of independence from the United States. Iran began selling oil to the USSR and the communist nations of Eastern Europe. Economists predicted Iran would be a first world nation within a generation. By 1975, Iran was a true regional power and the most influential nation in the region. But all was not well in Iran, nor with the Shah. In 1974, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was diagnosed with lymphoma, or blood cancer. He had special doctors flown in from Europe to treat him, but his eventual demise was undeniable. A proud man, the Shah hid this information from most people, including his wife. She did not find out until 3 years later when the Shah's doctor told her without his permission. As his cancer progressed, the Shah began limiting his public appearances, but he also became more concerned about a successor. His son was only 14 years old, still too young to take the throne. The Shah had worked for years to concentrate power in his hands. He delegated very little authority and consumed himself with managing every single issue he learned about. Ironically, this only put him even more out of touch with the reality of Iranian life. Hence, there were no competent bureaucrats to run the nation until his son came of age, and he did not trust the parliament. For now, the only thing he could do was continue with his plans to bring Iran into the 20th century. The Shah reinvested much of Iran's huge oil boom back into the nation. Once again, the Shah's good intentions had unforeseen negative side effects. Injecting billions of dollars into a third world economy all at once caused many problems. Corrupt politicians and businessmen took advantage of the spending spree and grew rich with kickbacks and secret deals. This led to a few people getting fabulously wealthy and creating a new Westernized elite class. This subsequently increased the demand for Western manufactured goods, which angered Iran's local merchant class. Inflation was another problem the oil boom brought to Iran. Prices soared and poor people could no longer afford staple foods. These problems were intensified by Iran's fairly large population and fairly small agricultural system. Iran's climate simply does not allow for large, modern industrialized farms. This was further exacerbated by so many peasants leaving the country and moving to the city. Iran did not produce enough food for all of its people and was forced to import most of it. But with prices so inflated, Iran's poor people were faced with difficult choices. Iran did not yet have the ability to keep up with the Shah's ambitious plans. His infrastructure projects required technical skills and materials that Iran did not have. This led to production bottlenecks, unfinished projects, and broken government promises. But the Shah was unaware of the growing unrest in his country. He pinned all discontent on a conspiracy of backwards-thinking religious fanatics and reactionary leftist communists. He did not understand that his people needed more than Western manufactured trinkets and brand new buildings. In interviews, the Shah admitted a desire to slowly introduce democratic reforms. He indicated the desire to one day relinquish control of the government to the politicians. But in reality, he did very little of either. Labor unions had been compromised by Savak, which had set up pro-government unions to neutralize them. The Shah circumvented the judicial system by shifting power to special courts run by the government ministries. He then abolished all local district courts and moved their cases to the special courts. In 1975, the Shah abolished all political parties in Iran and created a single-party system called Rastakhiz. Rastakhiz, which meant resurgence was similar to the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and Syria. The pillars of this new party were monarchy, constitution, and white revolution. Journalists were highly censored. Newspapers were banned from printing anything that might even appear critical of the Shah. They were not even allowed to print articles critical of Tehran's horrible traffic congestion. Thousands of political prisoners languished in prison. Estimates ranged between 4,000 and 40,000 political prisoners in Iran. In 1976, Amnesty International published a report stating Iran was one of the world's most repressive nations. And the Shah still had his differences with Iran's religious community. He further damaged his reputation with them when he suddenly abolished the Islamic calendar and replaced it with a Persian imperial calendar. Overnight, the date changed from the Islamic year of 1355 to the Persian imperial year of 2535. An Islamic resurgence. In June of 1975, seminary students at Feyziya College in Qom commemorated the 1963 protests against the White Revolution. During these events, they praised Ayatollah Khomeini, which was forbidden by law. Security forces surrounded the school and ordered the students to surrender to arrest. When the students refused, the police resorted to tear gas and high-pressure water hoses. After 4 days, Iranian commandos stormed the school and arrested most of the students. Many students were beaten and some even injured, but none were killed. Nonetheless, rumors began to spread that dozens of students were killed and imprisoned. Khomeini heard that 45 students were killed and encouraged his followers to avenge the martyrs of Qom. The Shah dismissed the incident, stating it was a collaboration of the red and black forces in Iran. Red for the communists and black for the religious extremists. But he did order the closure of Feyziya College. Meanwhile, across the Middle East, more and more people were turning back to religion. Dissatisfied with the materialism and consumerism of the West, young people began looking for answers in Islam. Adopting Western culture and norms had not brought them the independence and freedom they'd been promised. Instead, they were suffering under Western-backed dictators and being humiliated by non-Muslim countries like Israel and India. By the mid-1970s, young men in Iran and throughout the Middle East were regularly attending classes and lectures in the mosques. Young women began wearing their hijab in public. Even members of the Shah's own family did not escape this religious tide sweeping the region. Princess Shahnaz was the Shah's eldest daughter, but the two had never really been close. As a teenager, she had been shipped off to a boarding school because of conflicts with her stepmother. While overseas, the princess fell in love with a man named Khusro Jahanbani. Jahanbani was from the Qajar dynasty, which had been overthrown by the princess's grandfather, Shah Reza Pahlavi, the father of the current Shah. Her father, the current Shah, disapproved of the relationship, but that only seemed to push them closer together. At first, the young couple spent a lot of time in the New York City hippie scene of the late 1960s. They used drugs and dabbled in all sorts of spiritual trends and practices. However, by the mid-1970s, they had outgrown most of that stuff and had become serious practitioners of Islam. They returned to Iran, spent most of their time in local mosques, and became two of the government's most vehement critics. Another example was Patrick Ali Pahlavi, the Shah's nephew. Patrick's father, who was the Shah's brother, had died in a plane crash in 1954. Patrick's Polish mother had raised him as a Catholic. Like his cousin, Princess Shahnaz, Patrick also embraced the hippie culture of the 60s, spending most of his time in San Francisco. While there, he studied various spiritual philosophies before returning to Iran and converting to Shiite Islam. Patrick also became an outspoken critic of the Shah and was imprisoned several times. From boom to bust. In 1977, Iran's economy ran into a brick wall. The oil boom suddenly came to a halt as the world adjusted to higher oil prices. Western nations started putting more emphasis on fuel economy. Japanese vehicles with small tanks and great gas mileage became more popular, and a growing environmental movement shifted the focus to fuel conservation. On top of all this, Saudi Arabia increased oil production, pushing oil prices down. Nonetheless, the Shah of Iran refused to follow the market and lower Iran's oil prices. This led oil merchants to buy cheaper Saudi oil. The Shah was forced to halt various infrastructure and building projects. Thousands of people were suddenly out of work. Despite all of this, he would not decrease his military spending. In fact, he invested billions in military projects that weren't even needed. Iran's budget ran a deficit for the first time in years, and the Shah was forced to take out a $500 million loan to make up for the shortfall. Later in the year, the Shah used some of this fancy new weaponry to support Somalia in its fight against Ethiopia. Ethiopia was backed by the Soviet Union and Somalia by the United States. Ayatollah Khomeini was still active in Iraq, though the nation's powerful new vice president, Saddam Hussein, wanted him gone. The Shah, however, dismissed Khomeini's growing popularity as a passing fad. The Shah felt the Ayatollah was part of a dying breed of religious fanatics. This showed just how out of touch the Shah was with the common Iranian. Most Iranians were poor and religious and felt more of a connection with men like Khomeini than with the Shah. The Shah was not even aware of Iran's growing religious fervor, as he spent most of his time around the wealthy, less religious members of the elite. The Shah did not even bat an eye when Ayatollah Khomeini's son, Mustafa, died that October while in Savak custody. 1977 ended with a massive earthquake in Kerman province in rural southeastern Iran. This disaster struck during the night, killing over 500 people. The Uprising. President Jimmy Carter rang in New Year's 1978 with the Shah and his family. At the time, Iran was not really important to President Carter. He was more concerned about the ongoing peace negotiations between Egypt and Israel. President Carter had campaigned on restoring faith in the U.S. government. Government lies about the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, and various CIA plots had eroded American trust in its government. Jimmy Carter hoped a renewed interest on peace in the Middle East and human rights would uplift American spirits. That was the main reason Carter was in Iran. He intended to tie U.S. aid to Iranian human rights improvements. The Shah was gracious to the president in public, but he was insulted by Carter's demands. In several interviews, the Shah insisted these human rights concerns were overblown, exaggerated, and none of America's business anyway. During a televised New Year's reception, President Jimmy Carter praised the Shah and his policies. The two men clinked glasses of champagne and toasted their nation's long relationship. Millions of religious Iranians saw their king drink alcohol on national television. Barely a week later, Iran's leading newspaper, Etilat, published an article called Iran and Red and Black Colonization. The article criticized Ayatollah Khomeini, accusing him of working on behalf of the British to recolonize Iran. The article stated Khomeini was only pretending to be a religious man, and that he was really from India and not from Iran. To this day, no one knows who really wrote that article, but it certainly came from someone within the government. The editor of Itilat later claimed that he did not even want to publish the article. He said it was in poor taste and obviously a personal attack on Khomeini. But he said government officials forced him to include it in the weekend edition. The most he could do was bury the article near the back of the paper, cramming it into a few tiny columns. The Shah was in Egypt at the time of publication, attending a meeting on Egypt-Israeli peace talks. Many have said he saw the article and approved of it, but it is unlikely that he actually ordered it to be published. Whichever government official wrote that article inadvertently lit the spark that started the fire that ended the Pahlavi dynasty. Most Iranians neither saw nor read that article, but a few of Khomeini's admirers in Qom did read it and staged a protest against it 2 days later. After all, by this time, Khomeini's popularity was enough to be considered a marjah, and one just doesn't insult a marjah like that. Dozens of seminary students marched through the streets of Qom. Some of them attacked and burned a couple of Itilat newsstands. Iran's security forces descended on Qom to suppress the riots. Tensions rose and the police opened fire on the protesters, killing 6 students. The protesters scattered, but the anger against the regime boiled over. Religious scholars throughout the nation condemned the Shah for the violence. Several scholars signed a letter demanding an apology. Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Qasim Shariat Madari, who was critical of Khomeini and believed Islamic scholars should stay out of politics, issued a rare rebuke of the violence. The Bazaris, or merchant class of Iran, joined the religious establishment in their condemnation of the killings. They went on strike and closed most of the bazaars in Tehran in protest. Ayatollah Khomeini, still sitting in exile in Iraq, railed against the Shah and praised the martyrs. Via cassette tape, he ordered his followers to observe the customary 40 days of mourning, and when that was over, the people should rise up against the Shah's corrupt rule. 40 days later, on February 17, 1978, protests broke out in Tabriz, 300 miles northwest of Tehran. What began as a protest against the killings in Qom turned into a riot. The rioters targeted symbols of Western culture, destroying and burning several businesses. Over 70 movie theaters, banks, and hotels were destroyed. The police tried to stop the riots, but they were overwhelmed. They eventually resorted to deadly measures, and by the time it was all over, another 9 protesters were killed and dozens more injured. Over the next 5 months, there were sporadic demonstrations and occasional violence all over Iran. But the country was still functioning, and the Shah was still very much in control. Even though his lymphoma forced him to limit his public appearances, he was still acting as the leader. The various opposition movements against the Shah were mostly underground and fairly small. There was no coordination or cooperation between them. Most of the acts of vandalism were usually caused by small groups of fewer than 10 people. 40 days after the killings in Tabriz, the religious leaders of Iran called for a nationwide day of disciplined mourning. Some of these demonstrations got out of hand, but they were mostly peaceful. In May 1978, thousands turned out in Tehran to protest against the Shah. Troops fired into the air, but no one was killed. The next month, another nationwide protest was called. Some parts of Tehran and a few other cities were temporarily shut down. But since it was poorly organized, it didn't have much impact. But most could tell that the unrest was not going to go away. Though the protests and riots were poorly organized, they were intensifying. 25 people were killed when police opened fire on demonstrators in Yazd in central Iran. Another 15 were killed in response to riots when a Khomeini lecture ordered Iranians to kill the Shah. Bombs were going off almost weekly. Banks and cinemas were constantly being burned down, and Iranian students all over the world were protesting the Shah. And the government was not giving in either. Savak, the secret police, were working hard to shut down the protest movement by arresting hundreds of suspects. The government launched an intimidation campaign against Iran's Islamic scholars. Soldiers began raiding Islamic classes, beating the teachers and burning their books. A few students were even killed. Other religious leaders were exiled from the large cities and sent to remote areas of the country. However, by July 1978, the protests had mostly died down as the Shah seemed to indicate that he was serious about change. To appease the religious establishment, he reopened Fazia College, which had been shut down after the 1975 student protests. He ordered the release of hundreds of political prisoners. He dismissed Nematullah Nasiri, the head of Savak, and reassigned him as ambassador to Pakistan. He promised to introduce reforms that would lead to more individual freedoms. And just as it seemed the Shah might have a handle on things, it all fell apart. First, 2 influential Shiite scholars died in late July. One died in a car accident in Iran, another died of old age in London. 40 days later, a mourning procession for the deceased scholars turned into an anti-government riot. The police came in, opened fire, and killed 7 people. 10 days later, a luxury hotel in Isfahan in central Iran was attacked by 500 rioters. 9 days after that, the Rex Theater in Isfahan caught fire and over 300 people were killed. The fire was mostly set by anti-Shah rebels, but government negligence contributed to the high death toll. The local fire brigade did not have proper firefighting tools, and several nearby water plugs were either broken or paved over. Panicked by the sudden increase in violence, the Shah dismissed his cabinet and appointed a new one to deal with the unrest. The new government responded by banning all unapproved public demonstrations and declaring martial law in several major cities. On September 8, 1978, the day after martial law was declared, 200,000 people demonstrated in the streets of Tehran. At first, things were mostly peaceful. The protesters shouted death to the Shah and gave flowers to the soldiers. But then things started getting out of control and the military opened fire on the protesters. 98 people were killed and over 200 were injured on what came to be known as Black Friday. A week later, as if things couldn't get worse for Iran, a major earthquake hit the village of Tabas in northeastern Iran. The earthquake would turn out to be one of the most devastating in Iran's history. It measured 7.7 on the Richter scale, lasted for about a minute, and claimed over 15,000 lives. Tabas and several surrounding villages were completely destroyed. Before the earthquake, Tabas had a population of 13,000. Afterwards, it only had 2,000. All 20 of the local doctors were killed. And then came the labor strikes. It started with Iran's oil workers going on strike to demand higher wages. The next month, the banking industry went on strike. Then, 4,000 newspaper workers walked out to protest new censorship laws. Thousands of civil servants and teachers also walked off the job. 3,000 copper miners went on strike. Television, radio, and hospital workers all went on strike, demanding higher wages and the freeing of political prisoners. Even the national airline, Iran Air, was shut down by labor strikes. If the Shah had the will, he might have still been able to save his reign. After all, his primary critic, Ayatollah Khomeini, had been silenced in Iraq. Saddam Hussein had assigned 40 soldiers to watch over Khomeini, who was virtually under house arrest. Khomeini was prohibited from speaking publicly or from giving private lessons. This should have been an opportune time for the Shah to try to regain control of the situation. But the Shah had given up. Weakened by his cancer, depressed by the protests, he essentially shut down. And since he had controlled most of the government levers for so long, the government shut down as well. While Iran burned around him, the Shah preferred to remain in isolation either in his palace in Tehran or at his personal resort on Kish Island in the Persian Gulf. Saddam Hussein in Iraq was growing tired of Khomeini. Since Iraq was predominantly Shiite, he was worried the chaos in Iran might spill over the border into his country. On October 6, 1978, Saddam Hussein expelled Khomeini from Iraq. This move, more than any other single action, sealed the Shah's fate. Ayatollah Khomeini wound up in France, eventually settling in the Paris suburb of Neauphle-le-Château. Even though French officials requested he refrain from political activities, the Ayatollah received thousands of visitors and was followed by throngs of journalists. In Iraq, Khomeini had been almost entirely cut off from the world. The only way he could communicate with his followers was if they visited him or via cassette tape. Those cassette tapes might not be released to the public until several weeks after they were recorded. But in France, the media broadcast Ayatollah Khomeini's face to all corners of the world in real time. He could deliver a message and his followers would instantly receive it. Up to this point, the protest movement in Iran had been intense but lacked a leader. Khomeini became its leader in France. And when France relaxed its ban on Khomeini's political activities, the Shah's downfall was inevitable. Khomeini openly met with visiting opposition leaders, yet he refused to meet with any of the Shah's representatives. He told his followers he would never return to Iran so long as the Shah was in power. He urged the military to stop supporting the Shah and unite with the people. Khomeini began to discuss his plans for Iran's future. He voiced his desire for an Islamic Republic in Iran with universal suffrage and universal justice. But he was careful not to go into too much detail. He insisted he did not want to impose anything on the people. The only way an Islamic Republic would happen would be if they voted for it. He also insisted that he would not be the leader of this new government as he was 78 years old and politics was a young man's game. As he outlined his new government, he did make a few promises. He promised to disband Savak, the secret police. He promised to ban alcohol and immoral movies. He promised to retain parliament, but that it must work with the religious scholars. He promised peasants and farmers would not have to return land that they had received from the White Revolution. Back in Iran, the country was rocked by massive protests, rioting, and violence. On October 11th, 3 students were killed when soldiers opened fire on a demonstration at Tehran University. 2 weeks later, 11 more protesters were killed by police when they tried to set fire to Savak offices. 2 more protesters were killed the same day in West Iran. On November 6, major riots tore through Tehran. The British embassy was burned. The information ministry was attacked. Banks, police stations, movie theaters, and hotels were set on fire. Prime Minister Sharif Imami, barely in office 3 months, resigned the next day. With the Prime Minister's resignation and the Shah out of the picture, the military took over the government, but they could do little to stop Khomeini's movement. From his residence in France, Khomeini ordered his followers to make lists of government officials to punish when the new government was established. He ordered his followers to launch a new labor strike to coincide with Muharram, Shiaism's holiest month. He encouraged Iranians to stop paying taxes. International flights in and out of Iran were canceled. President Jimmy Carter blasted his country's intelligence community for not anticipating the problems in Iran. Most nations closed their embassies and got their citizens out of Iran. France warned Khomeini not to use their land to launch a revolution, but to no avail. Khomeini kept the pressure on. The movement had a leader now, and he was not letting up. Massive demonstrations, timed to coincide with the celebration of Ashura, crippled Iran's largest cities. 1 million protesters in Tehran, 800,000 in Mashhad, 700,000 in Tabriz, 300,000 in Isfahan. Iran's oil output was now so low, the country had to import oil just to meet their basic needs. All government schools in Tehran were closed, and with electrical workers on strike, Tehran experienced daily blackouts that lasted up to 5 hours. Throughout all the confusion, one thing was certain: the Shah was done. Politicians were openly talking about a post-Shah regime. Some suggested he abdicated in favor of his son, but that idea was quickly abandoned due to the boy's youth. Others suggested the Shah become a figurehead, but they knew this would not sit well with Khomeini and his followers. By January 1979, the new Prime Minister, Shapur Bakhtiar, confirmed that the Shah was ready for a brief exile. Iran's military leaders, traditionally loyal to the Shah above all else, were opposed to this idea. At this time, however, only those closest to the Shah knew of his illness. The military leaders were willing to establish a military government until the Shah was ready to return. They also expressed willingness to use deadly force to stop the protests. But within a few days of the new year, the Shah made it clear that would not be necessary. He announced he and his wife would be leaving Iran on an extended vacation. His representatives said the Shah had reached a compromise with the opposition. He would become a figurehead monarch while a true republic was established, but retain control over the military. No one was fooled by this. Everyone knew if the Shah left Iran, there was no way he'd be allowed back in. With this announcement, the way forward became clear. Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar said Khomeini would be welcome to return to Iran. He also said his government had reached a compromise with the religious establishment, but was light on details. The Prime Minister stated he wanted to allow time for the Shah to leave and did not want to alienate the military. On the other side of the planet, Western leaders, including President Jimmy Carter, were meeting in Guadeloupe to discuss the situation in Iran. The United States announced they were withdrawing its support for the Shah and declared its support for the Prime Minister. The Shah, meanwhile, continued to prepare for his pending exile. He transferred $1 billion to a royal charitable foundation. He made preparations for his children to settle in the United States. Then he ordered the release of hundreds of prisoners. On January 10, 1979, Prime Minister Bakhtiar announced the end of martial law throughout most of Iran. Riots and protests were still strangling the nation, but the government was helpless. The military was loyal to the Shah, who at this time was still in Iran and whom they considered their commander-in-chief. And Bakhtiar was the official prime minister, but his government was fragile and he had little true authority. To make things worse, Ayatollah Khomeini even blasted Bakhtiar's government. He said Bakhtiar was installed by the Shah, who was a criminal, hence his rule was illegitimate. Though he was not in Iran, Khomeini was by far the most popular man in Iran. And this statement destroyed any chance Bakhtiar had to establish any semblance of authority. In the midst of this confusion, the military and police abandoned the cities and returned home. Anarchy reigned as rioters swarmed across Tehran, attacking government buildings and setting fires. On January 15, 1979, the Shah announced he would be leaving Iran the next day. His supporters still held out hope he might return as a figurehead monarch, but most realized that this was the end and he would never return. Inside the palace, the Shah threw a small party for his family and a few friends. The younger members of his family had already left to begin a new life in Texas. Outside, the streets of Tehran were full of demonstrators singing songs and chanting Khomeini's name. With tensions easing, the soldiers no longer attacked the demonstrators who handed them flowers. On Tuesday, January 16, 1979, the Shah departed the palace with his wife, Queen Faradiba, by his side. They were surrounded by a small knot of security, military officials, and advisors. The palace staff cried as the two walked away. One general threw himself at the Shah's feet, kissing his shoes and begging him not to go. The Shah gently lifted him up and continued towards their helicopter. The helicopter flew them to Mehrabad Airport, and there the Shah had a final conversation with Prime Minister Bakhtiar. Then he and his wife boarded the plane, which taxied down the runway and lifted off, headed to Egypt. The Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran erupted in celebration and rejoicing when the news of the Shah's departure became known. People honked horns in the streets. Pictures of the Shah and his symbols were torn down and set on fire. From France, Ayatollah Khomeini announced he would be returning soon to help set up a provisional government. He expressed hope that it would lead to an Islamic Republic. On February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini set foot in Iran for the first time in 14 years. Within 10 days, his supporters had overrun Tehran and taken control of the city. The next several weeks were chaotic as the country tried to come to grips with its future. The imperial army vowed to remain neutral until a new government was established. But even before a government was established, Khomeini's followers were ready to dole out justice. Several high-ranking members of the Shah's administration were arrested, tried, and executed by firing squad. Ni'matullah Nasiri was executed on February 15th. He had been the former head of SAVAK but was sacked and appointed as the ambassador to Pakistan. 3 months later, the Shah recalled Nasiri from Pakistan and had him arrested for corruption. He was still in prison when the Shah left Iran and Khomeini's followers took over. Reza Naji and Amir Rahimi were executed at the same time Nasiri was. They were both martial law governors during the uprising. Nasser Moghadam was executed on March 11th. He had replaced Nasiri as head of SAVAK. He'd been on the job less than 3 months when the Shah left. Amir Abbas Hoveyda was executed on April 7th. He was the former prime minister of Iran and was suspected of writing the article criticizing Khomeini. The Shah had him arrested the previous November to try and appease the protesters. Hoveyda was still under house arrest when the Shah fled. Hassan Pakravan was executed on April 11th. He was also a former head of SAVAK but had long since retired by the time the uprisings began. Nonetheless, he was arrested, tried, and found guilty on multiple charges. On March 31st, the people of Iran took to the polls to choose their new government. 98.2% voted for an Islamic Republic. The next day, Iran announced to the world that it was now an Islamic Republic and Ayatollah Khomeini was its first supreme leader. The United States formally recognized the new government, but that did not bring the nations any closer together. 7 months later, several Iranian students claiming loyalty to Ayatollah Khomeini stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 70 hostages. At first, Khomeini denounced the kidnapping, but then decided to support it. Khomeini's new government was upset with the United States for admitting the Shah for medical treatment. They suspected the United States was helping the Shah overthrow the new Islamic Republic. Khomeini refused to release the hostages until the United States turned over the Shah for trial in Iran. Khomeini freed women and African American hostages, but the rest would remain in Iran for over 400 days. The Shah died less than a year after the hostage-taking. The hostage crisis ultimately led to the downfall of Jimmy Carter's presidency. They were finally released on January 20th, 1981, the same day Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president. In retrospect, this may not have been a wise move for Khomeini. The United States has never forgiven Iran, and the two countries remain enemies to this day. Over the years, the United States has frozen billions of dollars of Iranian assets and has imposed several layers of sanctions. In 2015, President Barack Obama came closest to normalizing relations and lifting some of the sanctions in an internationally sponsored nuclear deal. However, his successor, Donald Trump, pulled out of that deal and imposed even stricter sanctions on Iran. A year and a half after the establishment of the Islamic Republic, Iraq invaded Iran, hoping to take advantage of the new government's weakness. Iran was caught by surprise at first, but eventually rallied. The Iran-Iraq War lasted over 7 years, and almost 1 million people were killed. To fund his war machine, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein had to borrow a lot of money, including $14 billion from Kuwait. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The United States, led by President George H.W. Bush, formed an international coalition and launched Operation Desert Shield. The United States has had a military presence in the Middle East ever since. Epilogue. The Soviet Union was the first country to recognize Iran's new Islamic government. But Khomeini despised the Soviets just as much as he did the Americans. As Iran's relationship with the United States worsened, more and more American warships began patrolling the Persian Gulf. The USSR was suspicious, as this gave the United States an excuse to get closer to Soviet soil. Even though the Shah was never a true ally of the Soviet Union, at least they could work with him. The Soviets had no idea how to handle this new Islamic Republic and their elderly supreme leader. With Pakistan and India both vying for American support, the Soviet Union wanted to secure their limited holdings in Central Asia. One of the things they wanted to be sure of was that the new communist government in Afghanistan was stable. They would do so even if that meant an invasion.